should I contest what ICE is trying to do in the moment? Because I think because it's such an abrupt interaction, I think it's really important to understand, like, yes, in today's modern age, like, we all pull out our iPhones, we video things, because that's, of course, helpful in order to document what exactly happened. And you need to understand as an employer whether or not you want your people to be doing something like that. These are individuals that are armed law enforcement agents.
Welcome to Statutes of Liberty, an immigration podcast brought to you by Klasko Immigration Law Partners. The United States is many things: a great melting pot, a nation of immigrants, a land of opportunity. Millions have journeyed here seeking freedom and the chance for a better life. Belief in the American ideal means providing opportunities for everyone, regardless of race or birthplace, to achieve their highest potential. Join us as we unravel the ins and outs of immigration policy, from the issues of today to the historic basis for laws already in place.
Welcome back to the Statutes of Liberty podcast. I'm your host, Nick Lowrey. I'm an associate in Klasko's Washington, D.C. office. Today, we are joined by Klasko's D.C. office managing partner, Timothy Darduini. Tim, 20 years in the immigration industry, you have represented some of the largest organizations in response to some of the largest ICE enforcement efforts under the current administration and prior administrations. I think you are the perfect special guest for today's episode. Today's episode is the first of a 4-part mini-series on worksite compliance. We're going to be talking everything worksite compliance, from ICE to HSI investigations, I-9 compliance. Tim, welcome to the pod.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. Glad to be here.
So, Tim, it is no surprise that the headlines are riddled with news stories about immigration and customs enforcement really increasing its enforcement efforts, scrutinizing employers, identifying where there may be unlawful individuals working at different companies. Tim, in light of this backdrop, how does a company become a target in the eyes of ICE for these types of enforcement efforts?
Well, I would first of all say that we probably want to stay off of X. And that employers really, in the current administration, need to first look at who they are and whether or not they reasonably believe that they have an employee population that could be under or unauthorized. And what I mean by that is there are a number of high-risk industries that the Trump administration and historically those of us who have practiced in this area understand are difficult to fill jobs in. And those could include manufacturing, they could include meat packing, they could include hospitality, food and beverage, and agriculture. And those particular industries are a real focus by the administration because of historic hiring practices in those industries. So I think certainly knowing who you are and the type of industry you're in is important. I think another really important consideration for employers is to understand what types of investigation or scrutiny have you come under before, in terms of whether that be I-9 compliance, whether or not that's been wage and hour division by the Department of Labor, and understanding whether or not you may in some way be hiring foreign nationals that in some way could be perceived as affecting the wages and working conditions of U.S. workers, meaning U.S. citizens, permanent residents, asylees, or refugees. So certainly if you've had investigations before, the government has data relating to your enterprise and its historic practices, and those types of enterprises are certainly scrutinized heavily right now as well.
This is very helpful, Tim. I want to dig a little bit deeper into this last point, companies that have had prior investigations of some sort. Why is that a consideration for employers in relation to them becoming targets for ICE enforcement efforts?
Well, specifically, I think we've all seen this across the news. The Trump administration has shown a significant interest in data sharing amongst the different federal agencies, as well as state and local law enforcement agencies that the administration is partnering with under programs like Secure Communities. I would say that to the extent that there is data that the government has, again, relating to whether or not an employer has terminated someone because their work authorization has expired, is going to be directly relevant and something that the government could compare to its hiring records, including reporting that they have to do to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, relating to tax withholdings from individuals' wages. And when the government sees an inconsistency, meaning someone's work authorization has expired, but sees that an employer is continuing to pay and withhold taxes relating to that individual's employment, they're going to identify that particular employer as a target. And we've seen that, particularly with those employers that are enrolled in E-Verify, particularly where the government has issued notifications to those employers that they believe employers may indeed be continuing to employ someone who doesn't have work authorization. And that type of data sharing that results in those types of notifications are red flags for the Department of Homeland Security. And they're going to have an interest in going in, identifying those workers, arresting those workers, and looking at employer practices as to whether or not they have a pattern of this type of behavior.
Got it. Really. So kind of anything across the company that could be a red flag could end up in really a trigger for ICE to go in and do further investigation or enforcement.
Absolutely.
Understood. So when a company does become a target of one of these enforcement efforts, how does that typically start? What is the government's initial interaction with the company look like?
I think there are three particular ways that the government engages directly with an employer. And one is going to be through the I-9 notice of inspection process, which I know is going to be talked about at a different time. But that's certainly one way in which, and frankly, the least kind of confrontational or adversarial way. The other is that the government, meaning ICE, is going to work within the administrative agency themselves and get sign off on an administrative warrant, a warrant that is based on the premise that someone is working without authorization. And the ICE agents who receive endorsement of those types of administrative warrants can use it because they believe that someone does not have the ability to work in the United States or has otherwise violated their immigration status. And they can use that administrative warrant, whether it be at someone's outside of their home, in a public space like a park, or at the doorsteps of an employer. And so ICE can show up, speak to security, and ask that they would like to effectuate the arrest of someone who is undocumented or allegedly unauthorized to work in the United States. And that, again, is very different of a process, though it's been very, very widely used. And there has been all sorts of reporting that the administration has an interest in expanding the use of that instead of a judicial endorsed warrant. A judicial warrant to arrest someone is when you, as law enforcement, believe that you have probable cause to arrest someone, including, for example, violating immigration status. And ICE agents can go to courts, though they have been very, very hesitant to do so, instead use the administrative warrant process to go in and then arrest someone in those different environments. A judicially enforced warrant probably also provides them with greater ability to expand the scope of how they use that warrant inside of a workplace. If they believe that there are things like exigent circumstances, for example, to go beyond what would be the public space, like the reception or the security desk at an employer. And those are going to be the main ways in which ICE is going to seek to detain, arrest, and then prosecute individuals that are unauthorized. In the most extreme circumstances, and I've seen this in my career, you're going to see that ICE, in addition to wanting to use a judicially enforced warrant to arrest individuals, they'll also seek a judicially endorsed search warrant because they believe that there are perhaps more than one individual that should be arrested in light of their immigration status or immigration status violations. And they're going to need broader scope and authority to meander roam through the premises of both public and private spaces. And so it's really important as an employer that you understand what is the warrant that the ICE officer is presenting. What is its scope? And how are you going to handle those interactions? Because they can become quite intense.
Yeah. Between those different buckets, Tim, the term that is used pretty frequently in major media is a raid. Where does a raid fall into those three different buckets?
Raids are significant and coordinated efforts between usually ICE and other federal law enforcement authorities, including sometimes the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And in those circumstances, there will be certainly a judicially endorsed search warrant because the government believes that an employer in one of those high risk industries that I was talking about oftentimes has a pattern or practice of either hiring unauthorized workers or continuing to employ individuals that they know are not authorized or no longer authorized. And those situations are intense. They can result in dozens, if not hundreds, of immigration officers working together to show up, usually quite unannounced, because the surprise element is really important in these situations of raids in order for the government to most effectively, at least in their opinion, be able to arrest and detain a sizable population of individuals who've been unauthorized.
Got it. So I'm an employer. A government official shows up at the front door of my business. They give me a piece of paper. Do I have rights? What are my rights? What should I be doing in that moment?
Yeah, I think most employers at this point, and if they haven't, should really be thinking about what is the protocol that you have in place, as you imply, Nick, in order to deal with what is a difficult employer situation. I think the first thing that you have to do is make sure that the people at reception, at security, understand who the escalation point is within the employer that they need to reach out to immediately. Second, they need to understand that safety is oftentimes the paramount consideration that they should be concerned with when ICE shows up. Third, they need to explain to the immigration officials that they may not have the authority to allow them into parts of facilities that may require badge access or that may otherwise be visibly depicted as private or requiring authorization to enter a restricted area. I think a legal representative within the company or a designated representative that has on speed dial an immigration attorney and a criminal defense attorney to review the scope of a warrant is also absolutely critical because you're not going to have, practically speaking, someone in a position where there's probably a lot of turnover, like reception, be able to navigate both the sophistication of this as well as the alarming nature at which these types of interactions can speed through. And so I think that also you need then to understand where are you going to have conversations with the ICE officers if they're willing to have them with you that's away from the rest of your workforce so that you're not scaring your workforce in the midst of these types of interactions. Lastly, I think what we would say is you need to understand that having this protocol is one thing, but also giving your employee core training and knowledge that you have this plan in place is oftentimes very, very comforting and allows for what is otherwise a difficult situation to be at least somewhat more comfortable.
Got it. I want to get really practical here. Um, you're talking about developing a protocol. If I'm going back to my hypothetical, I'm an employer. I have 4 employees. I have 3 employees. I don't have anything written down, right? Where do I start? How do I develop this protocol? What does that even look like?
Yeah, I think everyone should be engaging immigration counsel in order to effectively be able to document these types of steps and again, give training to their employee population. Our team at Classify, we do this all of the time with companies. And, one of the big things that people say when they're thinking about, you know, how do I effectuate this policy is, should I contest what ICE is trying to do in the moment? Because I think because it's such an abrupt interaction, I think it's really important to understand, like, yes, in today's modern age, like we all pull out our iPhones, we video things because that's of course helpful in order to document what exactly happened. And you need to understand as an employer whether or not you want your people to be doing something like that. Because certainly these are individuals that are armed law enforcement agents. And so if you're going to encourage some type of real-time documentation, you certainly want to provide other safety tips, like how do you back away from the interaction from the officer and do so? How do you stand behind them by several feet while, for example, they may be moving into other parts of your premises? And if you're not comfortable with that, because that's just a difficult interaction that people just may not be comfortable with as well, then it's thinking about how do you memorialize after the fact what specifically occurred, whether it be through cameras that you may have located throughout your facilities, whether it may be documented notes or interviews that you or outside counsel may want to do with individuals that were part of the interaction with ICE. Because at the end of the day, ICE has a historic amount of funding right now and a historic lack of training of these officers. And so it's extremely critical. Listen, I think there was some testimony on the Hill by the acting former ICE director that they get 47 days to train individuals relating to these interactions. That is not a sufficient amount of time in order for law enforcement to be able to anticipate how they're going to handle every one of these different types of interactions. And so your people need to understand that safety in those moments, like I was saying, backing up or thinking about just reporting after the fact is really important to ensure a safe and stable workforce.
Yeah, month and a half doesn't seem like enough time to train somebody on every single right that falls under constitutional protection. I went to law school for several years and studied even more for the bar, and so fair point. Fair point there. So okay, so Tim, I've done everything right. I took down the protocol. I've trained my people. I put up some signage in my office building or my work site saying what is public versus private. ICE shows up. They gave me a piece of paper. I think it's a warrant. I took a copy of it. I made sure that it was signed by a judge. It looks like it's a judicial warrant. What should I be preparing for as a business in terms of the potential costs of this type of interaction? What are the penalties that could come as a result of this type of enforcement?
Well, I think the first thing for any corporation to be thinking about, or company, or even nonprofit organization, a museum, a healthcare system, regardless of your industry, and this is because I think it's directly relevant to your question as to whether or not this is going to also be something that is going to occur to your business. ICE is opening up 170 different offices throughout the country right now in local communities and taking enforcement of the immigration policies of this administration into different types of venues like religious institutions, like hospitals, in ways that they have not before. In addition to ICE being out there, what I would mention more than anything is that the reputational damage that can come with press surrounding these types of enforcement actions is probably the most significant for most enterprises, particularly if you're not a coastal business and you're in the heartland of the country. Like the politics surrounding this can be significant. Also, the reputational damage can result in other references or referrals, I should say, to other federal agencies.
Speak more.
What I mean by that is that simple immigration related violation, a simple violation of continuing to employ someone because there's been a public policy change that's eliminated a government program and someone's work authorization may have just been an innocent mistake. But if you are a meat packing plant And you also are regulated by the FDA and you regularly have, or OSHA, and you regularly have safety at your plant being evaluated by those federal regulators, you're going to see referrals to them and additional scrutiny and investigations in those areas. So, in addition to reputational harm, you're going to see referrals specifically to other federal agencies that could disrupt your business. And we haven't even gotten to the specific monetary penalties yet. We've just talked about operating your business. But after that, the government has a whole host of tools at its disposal. And those could be fines that are a few to several $1,000s for the hiring or continuing to employ unauthorized workers. Or I think in more dramatic situations where the government really does believe that company has a practice or a pattern of hiring or continuing to employ unauthorized workers, you could see charges of criminal conspiracies to defraud the government. You could see False Claims Act issues arise. Moreover, if you are simply a business like a landscaping company where maybe you provide support for transportation for your workers from a particular part of the community to your work sites, are you in some way facilitating the movement of people? Is there any type of smuggling charge? Or are you hiding individuals at your business simply because you told someone to go into the back room of your pizzeria or of your retail store? And those types of additional possibilities are certainly ones that I think the current Department of Justice, alongside of ICE, is going to be really interested in prosecuting nefarious employers for.
I want to tie together a couple points that you just mentioned there because I think this is very interesting. You started at the top of the podcast by mentioning that kind of issues outside of the employment potentially of unauthorized workers could flag for ICE an investigation into whether that's an issue with the company. And it seems like you're also saying the reverse is true, that if there is an issue, even if it's inadvertent with employing an unauthorized worker, that could lead to further investigation into these kind of other aspects of the company as well. And it seems like this can really get out of hand quickly simply because the government's
I think I'd call it my whole government enforcement approach.
Yeah.
One, it doesn't matter where the referral is coming from, but it may loop back around to immigration related violations. And immigration related violations, because it is such a hotly charged issue, is going to quickly turn back around or in a different direction back to the other entities that may be regulating your business. And that could be in professional services, for example, with organizations like the SEC or other related regulatory agencies.
So we talked quite a bit about kind of how a company can really prepare from the business side. I'm going to put my employer hat back on for a moment and say, those 3 or 4 people that I employ, they're my family. They're my friends. They're people that I've worked with for decades, and they are reaching out to me scared. Should I be giving them support? What type of guidance or help can I provide to my people, even if it's not really protecting my company?
I think this is really a question about organizational values and risk tolerance. And I think, for example, if you are a small mom and pop shop where you own a local pizzeria and maybe you employ a number of your extended or immediate family members, you may have a much greater risk tolerance or willingness, empathy to provide resources for the people that work for you. So, whether that be, for example, covering the cost of certain legal representation if someone were detained, or seeking to identify other immigration benefits that may provide them with the authorization to work. You may also consider what type of legal aid organizations are in your local community and may be good resources for your people, so that they know their rights in not just their work environment, but also out in the community, because that may engender a lot of trust with your employee population as they navigate really difficult things. What I would say as a human, as a leader, is I like to tell all of my clients, whether or not they're that smaller mom and pop shop or some of my larger multinational corporation clients, is you should always be encouraging people to seek resources for family planning. At the end of the day, some larger enterprises are not going to assume the risks of covering costs relating to legal representation for family members who may, at the end of the day, be arrested or detained, whether or not that be lawful or not by ICE. But you may be willing to put up a page that simply says these are resources that we have identified in the community or that our outside counsel has identified that you may find helpful in exploring. And make it clear, if you have a lower risk tolerance, that this is not legal advice, that you are not endorsing any particular immigration lawyer, legal services organization, or particular tool that may be available to prepare, because there's lots of them, frankly, on social media, in order to protect themselves. But nonetheless, because you as an organization do want to be able to say something and say something that's meaningful to your people, it's important at the end of the day they understand you're going to at least ensure that they feel heard.
Sure. Worst case scenario, one of those 3 to 4 people that I employed, they were detained. Is there anything that I can do or should do? Kind of what are the next steps? I, I'm floundering and I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think the first thing is making sure that you know who an immigration lawyer is that you could call, that maybe you could connect a family member with, because at the end of the day, you're likely as an employer going to make sure that you put that person on some type of paid leave for any time that they've accrued, or unpaid leave, or terminate them, depending on what the circumstances are. And those all have to be analyzed on a very case specific basis. I think, secondly, ICE does have a relatively helpful locator to try to understand where someone may be located in the detention process, because we've seen pretty rapidly ICE move individuals around throughout the country to detention centers that may not be anywhere close to the geographic region where they may be living or working. And so ensuring that the immigration lawyer has certain information, and this is what we would put in a family plan, for example, like someone's A number, their alien registration number, their date of birth information, is really important in order for that individual to be identified and then legal support potentially be provided.
It's very practical. I think we have given kind of a great roadmap to the organizations that are listening to this episode, how they can start to take steps at least to really be protecting their company, or at least kicking the tires on what the current compliance program looks like. I would be remiss if I didn't ask, what can Klasko do to help those companies really get their compliance programs up and running, or simply in better shape than they currently are standing?
I think the thing that a good law firm can do for their clients right now, because we're at an inflection point, in that there is a new bill right now that's being debated in Congress relating to additional funding for the Department of Homeland Security and ICE specifically. There is a new secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, is really understanding how are the priorities of this money and the new leadership within the Department of Homeland Security going to affect your business. I don't want us to be alarmist that what happened in Chicago or what happened in the Twin Cities towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year are going to be the new normal, but they may be. And I think for that reason, making sure that we're monitoring those things, the policy decisions and the announcements that are coming out of the administration are super important. Two, like I said, offices for ICE are popping up all over the country. And just because you think you may be insulated from this, talk to firms like Klasko who can help you make sure what makes sense for you. Because not everyone operates in the same environment. Some people, require people to be signed in as guests in parking lots, right? At certain interaction points there. Some people require you to sign in at a front desk. Some people just operate in public spaces like a retail store. And so understanding and making sure that you create that type of protocol, that you're educating your people, is something that we do routinely, and know that we have to flex to the particular contours of your business. And I think at the end of the day, if something does occur, and I think it would be remiss if we weren't realistic and say that it wasn't going to, you need to make sure that you have a good lawyer on speed dial. At the end of the day, knowing that someone is going to be able to jump in, help you navigate that interaction with ICE is a real-time exercise that, if you can simulate, would be great, but certainly you need an attorney on speed dial to address in real time.
Well, Tim, this has been a tremendous conversation. I think that we dug into some of the questions that candidly are just, they're not added as addendum to some of these really scary news stories that we see in the main media. And so, I'm glad that we could dig in a little bit into what are some real practical tips for our listeners. Please stay tuned. We're going to be addressing a variety of other topics related to worksite compliance. What happens if you get a notice of inspection? What is an e-verified desk audit? And just kind of a variety of other tips to be really strengthening your compliance programs. Again, this is just the first of 4 episodes, and we may throw a few bonuses in there for you. So, do all of the things that all the podcasts ask you to do: like, follow, subscribe. Please share the Statutes of Liberty podcast, and check that little notification bell so that you get those push notifications when we publish our next episode. So thanks for joining us today. And Tim, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Statutes of Liberty, an immigration podcast brought to you by Klasko Immigration Law Partners. For more information, visit us at klaskolaw.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. You can email your immigration questions to podcast@klaskolaw.com. The materials contained in this podcast does not constitute direct legal advice and is for informational purposes only. An attorney-client relationship is not created by listening to or accessing this podcast. The information provided should never replace informed counsel regarding specific immigration matters.